Good afternoon from Trinidad and Tobago, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Hosein. I am Senior Lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. On this beautiful afternoon in Trinidad, we have the wonderful opportunity to be in conversation with some of the authors and, of course, the editor of the recently published collection, The Asian Caribbean, the Asian Caribbean and the Caribbean Diaspora. And our lunchtime seminar today is titled The Asian Caribbean, Unpacking Histories at Home and in Diaspora. Before I welcome our speakers this evening, I would like to say that this lunchtime seminar is part of a series that began in 1998 in person, nearly weekly, in the then Center for Gender and Development Studies. And so it is lovely to be part of continuing that history. This conversation today is part of a series of conversations called Post-INDENTURE conversations that trace the ideas, life, and work of artists, writers, and scholars who have been producing all kinds of imaginative ways of thinking about legacies of indenture in the Caribbean diaspora, and whose work also attends to intersections of gender, sexuality, family histories, and feminisms in post-indenture sites, and those to which descendants of indentured workers have migrated. So while Dr. Ranjitsingh's collection doesn't specifically deal with that, that is the series theme. And of course, when we think of indentured workers in the Caribbean, indentured workers included Chinese, Indians, Portuguese, and others. So indenture is also a broad concept, and it's really great to be able to think about it in that broad way as well. This series started off with conversations with Andil Gosain first, then Dr. Ryan Prasadi and Pramika Leo talking about their film Gal Feminisms. We started with Dr. Gosain kind of telling us about the beginning of the field of art after indenture. We had conversations with Michelle Mohaber and Dr. Suzanne Prasad talking about Michelle Mohaber's film Coconut Cane and Cutlass and Women Loving Women in the Wake of Indian Indenture. We have had conversations with the South African artist Zenica Singh discussing her work with sugar, her artwork with sugar. And also had a session with Vinay Harichan of Cutlass Magazine and Nicola Cross on the film in Indian Inheritances Across and Beyond Caribbean Geographies, which was part of the broader exhibition, The Botanical Afterlife of Indenture, which I created in 2025. And our last session before this one was with Anima Jagro Rusin, Fazal Sher Mohammed, and Farah Rahman on listening to plants. They are Surinamese descendants, Indo-Surinamese descendants based in Suriname. And that's been the series so far. The entire series is available for viewing on YouTube, and so will this webinar, and we hope that you share it and draw on it at a future date. So the Asian Caribbean, Unpacking Histories at Home in the Diaspora. I want to say how pleased I am that we can be doing this webinar, kind of book launch, and just featuring of the work, the editorial work of Dr. Aleah Ranjitsingh. I am going to just read their bios and hand over to Aleah and the authors to discuss the work. I do want to say some things about their bios a little bit. Dr. Ranjitsingh is assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department and Caribbean Studies program at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Her research focuses on the Caribbean and the Caribbean diaspora, and her areas of interest include identity and identity formation, gender and ethnic identities, race, Blackness, and mixedness, and the process of racialization at home in the Caribbean and the diaspora. She is published in the Journal of Intercultural Studies, the Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy, the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies, and is co-author of Dogla in the 21st Century, Adding to the Mix, which was published in 2021. She's co-editor of Violent and Vulnerable Performances, Challenging the Gender Boundaries of Masculinities and Femininities. And this is her latest collection. And I must also say that Dr. Ranjitsingh received her PhD in the field of interdisciplinary gender studies from the Institute for Gender and Development Studies right here in St. Augustine. And so we are particularly proud to be able to see scholars move on and produce such excellent work, and to be able to learn so much ourselves from the work that they are producing. And so it's a proud moment for us to be able to feature Dr. Ranjitsingh's collection and to give it space and visibility. So welcome, Aleah. I'd like to also introduce Dr. Nikoli Attai, who received his PhD in Women and Gender Studies from the University of Toronto, a Master of Philosophy and Cultural Studies, and a Bachelor of Arts in Media and Communication from the UWI St. Augustine. His most recent book, Defiant Bodies, Making Queer Community in the Anglophone Caribbean, which has made a huge impact on the field, was published in 2023. His broader research focuses on queer experiences in the Anglophone Caribbean, beyond notions of disease and violence and the need to flee the region. He also investigates international queer asylum interventions in Canada and the Netherlands and decolonial cultural formations in Trinidad and Tobago and the Anglophone Caribbean. This work appears in several academic essays, and his forthcoming co-edited collection titled Free Up Yourself, Transgressive Bodies and Contestations in the Carnivalesque, which will be published in 2026. So congratulations on that. I must also say that by some miracle, I was Dr. Attai's supervisor for his MPhil Trans TT, and it is just so wonderful to see these kinds of publications and the ways that Dr. Attai has just become such an influential scholar in the field. Tarika Sankar is a critical scholar of Indo-Caribbean diaspora, race and ethnic studies, feminist studies, and digital humanities. She earned a PhD in English at the University of Miami and graduate concentrations in digital humanities and Caribbean studies. Her dissertation project, titled Beyond the Culture Concept, Indo-Caribbean Identity as Diasporic Consciousness, received a Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellowship. Her collaborative and individual research has been published in the Journal of Indentureship and its Legacies and the Middle Atlantic Review of Latin American Studies. She is currently digital humanities librarian at Brown University. Librarians are, of course, revolutionaries in their own ways. And Tarika, I want to welcome you to the space of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies and say how excited that we are to have you now as part of our community. Dr. Sandrine Soukaï is Associate Professor in Anglophone Studies at Gustave Eiffel University. Her research focuses on post-colonial literatures and theory, memory and trauma in literature and the arts, South Asian literatures, partition studies, indentureship and its legacies, Caribbean cultural production, creolization, and archipelagic poetics. She's published widely in edited volumes and peer-reviewed journals, such as Post-Colonial Literatures and Arts, Journal of Indentureship and its Legacies, Synergies Indie, and Post-Colonial Essays and Studies. She serves on the boards of the European Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies and the French Post-Colonial Studies Association. And on a personal note, it was lovely that in one of our last webinars on Indian inheritances across and beyond Caribbean geographies, the film that I made along with Cutlass Magazine and directed by Nicola Cross, that Dr. Soukaï's images contributed from her home and from her thinking about the botanical was part of that work. So many connections, which is so typical of the Caribbean. And I would like to now welcome Aleah to tell us about your collection, accept our congratulations, and share so much of what this collection contributes with those of us who are in the webinar. Over to you, Aleah.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen briefly. I will do so right now. Here we go. Here we go. So thank you so much, Dr. Hosein, for introduction and for hosting this event. I truly appreciate the invitation to be part of the Lunchtime Seminar Series at my alma mater, the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad, my home country. And I'm truly a proud graduate of the IGDS and, of course, the University of the West Indies. And I was very privileged to study under and with renowned Caribbean scholars and activists. So I'm truly, truly, truly grateful. It's a homecoming, of sorts. I'm also truly happy to celebrate this book, The Asian Caribbean in the Caribbean Diaspora, Essays on Migration, Identity, and Literary and Cultural Representations, and to do this with three of the contributors of the collection who are here today. And this collection is one of my love stories to the Caribbean. At Brooklyn College, I teach, as Dr. Hosein, mentioned in my bio, I teach in the Africana Studies Department and the Caribbean Studies program. And with my, my very Trini accent, I talk a lot about the Caribbean because I'm indeed a Caribbean scholar from a rich legacy of Caribbean scholars and scholarship. Professor Rhoda Reddock, who served on my PhD committee at the UE, and who I would speak to as I prepared my job talk for this current position on her 2014 article, Radical Caribbean Social Thought, Race, Class, Identity, and the Post-Colonial Nation, discusses the legacy of radical Caribbean intellectual thought, emerging and defined by the colonial context of the Caribbean space, by Caribbean people in the Caribbean, and of course, the diaspora as well. These have drawn on and critiqued the philosophies and theories of Pan-Africanism, Marxism, socialism, feminism. And in this way, what I have maintained throughout my scholarship and teaching is that the Caribbean is an epistemological space, and its people are knowledge producers. So this edited collection is actually dedicated to some Caribbean people. First, my daughter, Hope, who I call my Caribbean baby because she's, a mix of all things Caribbean, even with her little American accent. Then to my grandmother, Verena Shahida Ranjitsingh, Nee Muhammad, an Indo-Trinidadian woman whose stories of travels, caused me to also dream about, seeing the world. And then the late Professor Norman Girvan, who was my PhD supervisor and teacher, and who I wish I was here today so we could discuss everything that's happening, in the Caribbean today. So as you know, the collection is entitled The Asian Caribbean in the Caribbean Diaspora, Essays on Migration, Identity, and Literary and Cultural Representations. And I just want to read a little bit from the introduction to the collection. So I say, to historicize the Caribbean and the movement of Asians to the Caribbean space is to speak of the Americas and the indigenous peoples who were the first to be enslaved before the arrival of the Africans. It's to speak about Europe and the arrival of invaders who used violence to subjugate and civilize. It's to speak of Africa and the legacy of African slavery. More than 12.5 million Africans were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Only 10.7 million arriving to ports and plantations in the Americas. And Asia and the movement of free labor to the Americas as replacement for or supplement to African labor. So while this work, as Dr. Hosein mentioned, was not conceptualized under a framework of post-indenture feminism, by considering these intimacies, according to Asian American scholar Lisa Lowe, it does indeed frame the multi-ethnic relations as intrinsic to Caribbean societal formations. And it does recognize that we are living the lingering legacies of post-slavery and post-indenture lives. So a colonial inheritance of mixedness thus follows, including discourses which my colleagues, Suan Barrett and myself, we describe as foundational yet contentious, including hybridity, mestizaje, mestizaje, jibarismo, creolization, and duguralization, to account for this multiplicity and cultural exchange. So while this collection, it seeks to center an Asian Caribbean diaspora, it in no way positions an Asian Caribbean in isolation from the other racialized bodies and the processes which brought them to the Americas and the greater Caribbean, processes which in the framework of liberal personhood excluded them. So the chapters presented in the collection in which the contributors here will speak about, they are grounded in these histories of the Chinese who arrived in Cuba beginning in 1847, Trinidad in 1806, a failed experiment, and to the British colonies of Guyana and Jamaica and Trinidad again in the 1850s. It is grounded in the histories of Indian indentureship and the arrival of Indian indentured laborers in 1838 to Guyana, 1845 to Trinidad, 1873 to Suriname, with smaller numbers arriving in other British and French Caribbean colonies. Also, Japanese migration to Brazil beginning in the early 1900s, and the arrival to the Dominican Republic in 1956, and the Javanese arriving in Suriname beginning in 1890. It in no way, right, it does not cover the entire length and breadth of Asian migration to the Americas, but it centers the Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and Javanese diasporas in the aforementioned spaces. Right. And looking back now, I think one space I should have been sure to include was Haiti. And, this rich legacy of Chinese migration to Haiti. But it is something I worked on with one of my students 2 summers ago, right? The history of Chinese migration to Haiti. So the Asian Caribbean and the Caribbean diaspora, it is descriptive while also countering a limited discourse on the Caribbean diaspora. At its core, and as you will hear soon, it is a collection of stories of the transcolonial regimes that necessitated the movement of peoples across borders, stories of encounter on Caribbean plantations and later migrations as free migrants, compelled by emigration schemes and economic opportunity. It's stories of migration, encounters in diasporic urban centers, stories of lived experiences before and at the time of nation building, stories about families and tales and myths and memories and articles and objects passed down through generations, stories of return and homeland, stories of introspection, transformation, and finding self amid silences, stories of how Caribbean people create and write about and convey meaning about these stories and themselves. So herein lies the strength of this collection, approaching the subject through an interdisciplinary lens. The chapters thereby providing an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of the Caribbean diaspora, and the Asian Caribbean in the Caribbean diaspora. And just quickly before I turn over to the contributors, I just wanted a statistical look, right, at the chapters. And I'm so grateful to all of the contributors who worked with me to make this collection a reality. I think over 2 years, persons were receiving emails from me about, deadlines, edits, reviews, etc. And everyone was just really wonderful to work with. And as you could see, from a table of contents, right, how truly interdisciplinary this collection is. And again, I believe that this is one of its strengths. So we want to, I want to pass on to one of the contributors, Dr. Soukaï. And Dr. Soukaï's chapter falls within, the second set of chapters in the collection. So the collection is divided with, the collection is divided, right, in 3 sections. And Dr. Soukaï's chapter falls within the second set of chapters. And the second set of chapters speak to the literary representations of the Asian Caribbean diaspora and the ways in which Asian Caribbean people and lives are written and read through text, which convey meaning about Asian Caribbean histories and Asian Caribbean diasporic identities, subjectivities, experiences, understandings of home, and meanings of return. And Dr. Soukaï, as we could see here, your chapter is entitled Trans-Diasporic Indo-Caribbean Anthologies and Post-Amnesia Jahaji Bai. And in your chapter, you interrogate the notion of Jahaji Bai by exploring the concept, right, in two anthologies of Indo-Caribbean fiction, Jahaji, which was published in 2000, and Two Times Removed, which was published in 2021, through, the prism or the lens of what is described as post-amnesia. Now, these are two anthologies which either partially or fully focus on diasporic Indo-Caribbean life experiences. And in this way, the anthologies themselves become new Jahaji Bai. So first of all, would you define for us Jahaji Bai, right? For those of us who are not familiar with that concept, before moving on to the other concepts, what do you mean by post-amnesia and post-memory in this way? Dr. Soukaï?
Thank you so much, Aleah, for the introduction. Let me just say a word of welcome to everybody and good afternoon to everyone. A word of thanks before I start answering your questions. So I would like to warmly thank Dr. Gabrielle Hosein for her introduction and for welcoming us as part of this seminar series. I am truly delighted to take part in this discussion today. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us also online and the other contributors to the volume I'm also very pleased to meet online. Most importantly, I would like to warmly thank Dr. Aleah Ranjitsingh for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you for your remarkable work editing and guiding this collection, and for your patience and support throughout the process. Your comments and feedbacks were incredibly valuable, and I'm really honored to have contributed to the volume. So before answering your questions directly, I just would like to explain briefly why the topic matters to me personally and also academically. I come from a Guadeloupean family from the French Caribbean. I'm also descended from Indian indentured laborers who arrived in the Caribbean during the second half of the 19th century after the abolition of slavery to work on sugarcane plantations. So as a scholar on post-colonial Anglophone literatures, I first worked on South Asia and on the partitions of the Indian subcontinent before progressively turning toward Indian indentured diasporas and their descendants. So my initial focus was the Francophone Caribbean, especially Guadeloupe, where I come from, but I gradually expanded toward the Anglophone Caribbean and particularly Trinidad and Guyana, I'm looking at in the chapter here. So when I saw the call for papers, I immediately felt that it offered a great opportunity to pursue this transoceanic, transdiasporic approach that has become really central to my work. And so this is reflected in the title of the chapter, Echoes Across Oceans. In many ways, the chapter was an attempt to respond to the invitation of the call to rethink and expand the Caribbean beyond the geographical boundaries of the archipelago itself. So I adopted what I called a transdiasporic perspective by reading the anthologies as new forms of solidarity between Indo-Caribbean populations, shaped by multiple migrations, living across multiple spaces. So I wanted to show how the Caribbean also exists through networks of memory, circulation, storytelling, and relation, really extending far beyond the region, the Caribbean region itself. So the comparative and archipelagic perspective is also something I recently explored in a volume entitled Island India's Archipelagic Memory, co-edited with Ananya Janara-Kabir and Luca Raimondi, published by Brill last month. This is a volume that is tied to this publication I'm presenting today, this chapter. The volume proposes thinking about India through islands, oceans, circulations, rather than fixed national borders. So showing our memories, cultures, and identities move across connected yet fragmented spaces. So this resonates strongly with my own work on Indo-Caribbean identities across the Francophone and Anglophone Caribbean and beyond. So this brings me to the key concepts of this chapter. So as Aleah mentioned, the term Jahajibain is central to my chapter. The term comes from Hindi and Urdu and literally means brother of the ship or brotherhood of the ship. So the term refers to Indian indentured laborers traveling aboard so-called coolie ships across the Kalapani or the Black Waters during the 19th century. So crossing the Kalapani carried powerful symbolic meanings in Hindu traditions because sea crossing was often associated with ritual impurity and the irreversible loss of caste or community or homeland. So the crossing was not only geographical, but also social, spiritual, and even emotional. So these journeys lasted several months and were often extremely harsh. And so migrants traveled under coercion, deception. Many fled famine or poverty. Some did not survive the crossing. Yet during the voyage, caste divisions and social hierarchies were often weakened by shared hardship and proximity. So this is what the term Jahajibai gradually came to signify, as new forms of solidarity were created on board the ships. So several scholars have emphasized that this crossing even also generated new forms of cultural creolization. And this is also what I am working on. So my approach in the chapter is also a gendered approach, which is why I insist on the other term, so Jahajibain, meaning here a sister ship of the ship. So I use the term Bain rather than the more standardized Hindi form Behin, so Behen, because it reflects the vernacular diasporic linguistic transformations that emerged within Indo-Caribbean communities themselves. So this emphasis on sisterhood is important in the chapter because one of the anthologies I analyzed, so Two Times Removed, is primarily written by young women, descendants of indentured Indians. So many contributors of this volume belong to what we might call a second generation of the double diaspora. Their ancestors migrated from India to the Caribbean, and then their Indo-Caribbean parents migrated again to North America or Britain and the UK. And these young women were born and raised there. So some had never visited South Asia, and their relationship to India was often mediated and fragmented through family stories, silences even, partial memories, archives, and also later forms of creative or genealogical research. So many also discovered the Caribbean itself only gradually through these layered transmissions and recoveries of memory. So this is what the title, Two Times Removed, captures, this layered displacement. And the other anthology I studied, so Jahaji, was published 20 years earlier in 2000. Its contributors are mostly established Indo-Caribbean writers and scholars. And placing these two anthologies in dialogue allowed me to examine both continuities and transformations across generations. So I also deliberately began the chapter with a song, so lyrics from Brother Marvin's famous Chutney Soca song, Jahajibai, not only because I personally love the song and its fusion of Afro-Caribbean and Indian sounds, but also because it beautifully expands the meaning of Jahajibai itself. So in the song, the term no longer refers only to indentured Indian solidarity, but also to Afro and Indo-Caribbean brotherhood and shared plantation histories. So already the concept becomes creolized, relational, and collective. When I began thinking about this chapter, I actually had just attended a conference in Bonn in Germany, held by the Soukaï Association. And it was on competing memories of slavery and indenture. And this song, Brother Marvin's song, immediately came to mind as a way of thinking beyond competitive memories towards entangled histories and solidarities. And this is also what explains why these concepts remain so relevant today and why I chose to make them central to my chapter. So to answer the question about post-memory and post-amnesia, the concept post-memory was developed by Mariana Hirsch in relation to Holocaust memory. So very simply, post-memory refers to the way traumatic memories are inherited by later generations who did not directly experience a trauma themselves. So these post-generations, as she calls them, inherit fragments of stories, images, silences, emotions that are transmitted by grandparents, and they creatively rework them through literature, art, or storytelling. And I found this concept extremely useful for understanding how descendants of indentured laborers engage imaginatively with a traumatic past they did not directly experience. So in my chapter, I moved from the concept of post-memory to the concept of post-amnesia coined by Ananya Kabir in relation to partition, the partitions of the subcontinent in 47 and 71. And this is important because in many Indo-Caribbean families, indenture history was often minimized, forgotten, or not discussed, sometimes because of shame, because of trauma, because of colonial erasure. So post-amnesia really refers to the idea of reconstructing memory after long periods of silence and forgetting. And these younger generations are therefore, I believe, not simply inheriting stories, they are often trying to recover erased memories, erased histories. So this becomes particularly visible in the anthology, Two Times Removed, with younger writers that use digital archives, genealogy websites, blogs, social media, family photographs to reconnect with indenture history. And so, for example, I'm just going to quote a couple of examples. In Tiara Jade Chutkan's story, Dig a Little Deeper, the protagonist searches online archives and old photographs to trace her ancestry. And similarly, Karima Rahman's story combines fiction, archival documents, footnoting, activist writing to reconstruct mostly Indo-Caribbean histories erased both by colonial archives and contemporary nationalist politics. So memory work itself becomes fragmented, investigative, collaborative, and sometimes activist. So the chapter is structured into three parts. In the first part, I focus on recurring themes. So rootlessness, for instance, placelessness, and in-betweenness. For example, in Shani Mutu's Sushila Bhakti, the protagonist searches for connection with her ancestral origins through art and creative practice. In Sabita Prasad's Neither Here Nor There, the narrator struggles with being perceived as not really Indians by Indians from the subcontinent living in the UK, while not also fully being accepted elsewhere. So at the same time, these texts also show that diasporic displacement does not necessarily produce an irreversible rupture from an ancestral place of origin, nor a simple nostalgic desire to return to India. So what emerges instead is a powerful, creative, and literary reinvestment of India and South Asia at large. So in these stories, and this is what I found interesting also, ancestral origins are continuously reinterpreted through diasporic experience itself. And identity is neither seen as fixed, of course, or pure. So the second part of my chapter examines how Indo-Caribbean identity becomes creolized and constantly renegotiated. So Indo-Caribbean culture emerges through crossings, mixtures, and exchanges between India and the Caribbean, but also between Afro and Indo-Caribbean histories and cultures. And finally, the last part, the third part of the chapter focuses on silence, trauma, and post-amnesia. So many stories explore intergenerational silence surrounding migration or racism, colonial violence, family trauma. And the younger generation increasingly challenges these silences. Writing itself becomes an act of recovery, of transmission, and of resistance. So my central argument is that the anthologies themselves become new forms of Jajibai, Jajibing, and they bring together dispersed voices across generations, nations, and diasporas. So they create new communities of memory, solidarity, storytelling, and cultural transmission. So in that sense, I see the anthology not only as a literary form, but also a collective space of relation and belonging. So to conclude, what interested me most in these texts I analyzed was not only trauma or loss, but also creativity, reinvention, and connection. So the writers I examined transform these fragmented memories, silences, displacement into new cultural and artistic forms. And I think this is precisely why Indo-Caribbean literature, especially from younger generations, is so important today, because it helps us think about migration, memory, identity, and belonging, not as fixed categories, but as ongoing conversations across oceans, across generations and communities. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soukaï. And I want to say it's actually the first time I'm meeting Dr. Soukaï virtually, like seeing Dr. Soukaï, I should say. So it's just wonderful to be in conversation with you after emailing back and forth for about 2 years or so. And as you were speaking, I was just even like more sure of this collection and its strength, and even pulling together contributors for this lunchtime seminar. I see how all through our work, it's truly connected. And I see how, I truly see again, I'm reminded again of how, of the, how the collection, even though the chapters are truly interdisciplinary, that thread that runs through them, right? It is truly a book of a collection of stories. And of course, you argue that, in these anthologies, they do weave together a new intergenerational brotherhood and sisterhood, right? Particularly for Indo-Caribbean descendants in the diaspora. So thank you so much for that intervention. And I think it flows really beautifully into Dr. Sankar's work and her chapter. And her chapter, it comes from the third set of chapters, in the book. And the third set of chapters, it moves us to the representations of the Asian Caribbean and Asian Caribbean diasporic subjectivities and artistic and cultural representations, and the ways in which art and music as cultural production can convey cultural narratives, speak to and make clear historical and social context, and in many ways reforge political identities. And Dr. Sankar, your chapter is entitled, and let me just share my screen. Here we go, multitasking. Let me just stop share to reshare, and I do apologize. It is 2026 and still battling Zoom. So let me get to this slide. Here we go. Here we go. And Dr. Sankar, your chapter is entitled Chutney Songs, Indian Beats, and Black Music, Digital Diasporic Consciousness on Indo-Caribbean Social Media. And your chapter moves us from works of fiction, which focus on diasporic Indo-Caribbean experiences, to Indo-Caribbean social media and cultural forms. And you examine contemporary social media content and discourse by Indo-Caribbean online creators to understand the creation of what you term a digital, or the concept that's used in this chapter, a digital diasporic consciousness. And I do want you, to define for us, what do you mean by that, right? And how this digital diasporic consciousness, particularly, which is facilitated on social media, it may expose tension between Indo-Caribbean as a racial ethnic category and Indo-Caribbean as a diasporic consciousness. I'm going to pass it over to you to further introduce yourself, to make some comments before, of course, discussing your work.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me in this space and part of this series. I've attended some of the other sessions in the series, so it's honestly an honor to be included in this panel and part of the discussion series. So the concept of diasporic consciousness sort of comes out of my research and my lived experience as an Indo-Caribbean person in the diaspora. And Sandrine talked about the concept of double diaspora. and the Indo-Caribbean generation that sort of has lived or grown up outside of the Caribbean, in North America or in the UK or other places outside of the Caribbean. And what I was noticing is that like an Indo-Caribbean identity, or we could think of it as an Asian post-indentureship identity, is within the kind of racial vocabulary of the US is really an illegible identity. It doesn't have a place in sort of the racial categories and the groups that we normally think of in the US. So, in the US, we sort of have the racial categories Black, white, Asian. Indo-Caribbean doesn't neatly fit into any of those, being a hybrid identity. So it's just really hard to understand and conceptualize what Indo-Caribbeanness might mean in the US context. And so I was thinking about diasporic consciousness as a framework for thinking about Indo-Caribbeanness outside of bounded ideas of race and ethnicity. So when Indo-Caribbean as a racial or ethnic category is not really legible in the US, what are other ways that we can define what it means to be Indo-Caribbean in the double diaspora? And so diasporic consciousness is thinking about Indo-Caribbeanness more through the lens of multiple migrations and the history of indenture, and common experiences of rupture and dislocation and trauma, and all the things that Dr. Soukaï was talking about, and moving away from defining Indo-Caribbean through kind of the Indian ethnic origins or Indian culture. So what I was noticing on social media is kind of an increasing presence of the Indo-Caribbean diaspora through these different social media accounts, including the Cutlass magazine. And I know Vinay Harichan was a speaker in this series in one of the earlier presentations. And I was seeing that social media was a space where the diaspora was kind of working through or playing out these different contested ideas of Indo-Caribbean identity. So I was seeing kind of tensions between people who are defining Indo-Caribbean in more of the ethnic racial sense, and then people who are kind of thinking of Indo-Caribbean through that broader diasporic consciousness. And in particular, music stuck out as one of these realms, cultural concepts, where it really brought all of the music sort of as a flashpoint or a terrain where people were contesting identity, which makes a lot of sense because music is very important to cultural identity, Caribbean heritage, national identity, and all of those things. So in these debates that people were having, in the comments on Instagram, I was noticing this tension emerging between defining Indo-Caribbean as racial or ethnic group versus defining Caribbean as a diasporic consciousness. So that's what I kind of mean by a digital diasporic consciousness. It's sort of this rethinking of Indo-Caribbean identity and imagining how we can define it more expansively beyond purely racial or ethnic, or beyond sort of the Indian cultural origins. So I look at a couple examples of social media posts where people were having these conversations and sort of hashing out these different contested meanings around identity. One of those examples is a very controversial post that was actually reposted by the Cutlass magazine, and it was a graphic kind of naming all these different genres of music as Black music. So saying reggae is Black music, calypso is Black music, jazz is Black music, hip hop is Black music. And the intention of that post was to acknowledge the roots of many of these genres of music in the African diaspora and in Black culture. But they also included chutney as Black music in that list. And so that was a point of tension for a lot of people. And that was sort of the controversial area of the post. And so folks in the comments were debating around whether or not we should call chutney Black music. And there's so many different meanings and sort of racial context and geographic context that comes into play in that debate. So the really interesting thing about digital space and social media is that it brings together people from all around the globe, all different parts of the diaspora. And it gives you the sense that we're all having a conversation in the same place, but actually we're all coming from different places. And all of our ideas and concepts of race and privilege and Blackness and Indianness are informed by where we're located, right? So, how we might understand race is different if you're coming from the US context than maybe if you're coming from the Caribbean context. So people were coming from all these different places and bringing their different ideas about race into the conversation. And so one argument was that if you name chutney music as Black music, that erases the Indian cultural contribution and sort of the Indian origins of the genre. And I definitely understand that perspective and can see, you know, where the tension is there. But others were saying that that's not what it's about at all. And, you know, it's just acknowledging that there is Black influence on all kinds of genres of music. And I think it's also acknowledging what Dr. Soukaï was talking about entangled histories and like intimacies between Afro and Indian diasporas. And so what I was noticing is that and I'm speaking kind of in very general, broad strokes here, but I think that your position on that statement about chutney music and Black music kind of depends on whether you perceive you know, the Indian as marginal compared to Blackness, or whether you think of Indian as having certain privileges compared to Blackness. And that depends, I think, on whether you're in the Caribbean or the US or in Europe or wherever you're kind of geographically located. So in that debate, I was kind of trying to tease out those different threads of the conversation. And I think it also was a great illustration of what I mean by digital diasporic consciousness, because I think that if you think about Indo-Caribbeanness as defined by ethnicity or race, and as defined by kind of this more conservative idea of Indian culture, then it makes sense that, you know, you'd be very protective of chutney as like part of Indian heritage, and not wanting to see that erased. But I think that if you think of Indo-Caribbeanness as defined more expansively as a more politicized consciousness of these like diasporic dislocations, of the history of indenture, of migration and labor, that's a different way of defining Indo-Caribbean that isn't so, it doesn't keep Indianness isolated or separated from Blackness. And then we also have, you know, the idea of political Blackness, which has been around for a long time. So if you also think about Blackness expansively as a political category, not just a racial one, then that brings a different perspective to the idea of chutney as Black music. So I'm really thinking about digital diasporic consciousness as a way of not keeping us locked in this idea of Indian and African or Indian and Black as oppositional and separate, but rather thinking about those two identities as more thinking about those two identities more expansively and as intertwined and, you know, in relation to one another. So that was one example I looked at in the chapter. Another example was thinking about, this was more about Indo-Caribbeanness in relation to South Asian identity, and thinking about chutney music and Bollywood music and the interplay between those two genres, which I should also preface, I'm not a musicologist, so I just kind of stumbled into music as just a place where a lot of conversations were happening. But I was noticing like there are sometimes these like humorous posts on social media or commentary about how chutney music like quote unquote rips off of Bollywood music, or it's derivative essentially of Bollywood music in some way. But then I also saw a post from, again, on the Cutlass magazine, about this song, this Bollywood song. It was called Desi Wine, which is such an interesting combination of concepts. And that Bollywood song incorporated like steel pan and other elements of Caribbean music. And that was framed as, oh, look at the recognition that Caribbean culture is getting from mainstream Bollywood and from mainstream South Asian culture. And it was framed as like fusion rather than derivation, which I thought was really interesting compared to how people were saying chutney is like a derivative genre of Bollywood. So again, like I think that conversation kind of hinges on whether you view Indo-Caribbean as a marginal part of the South Asian diaspora, or whether you view it as more integral to South Asian identity or belonging to South Asian identity. And for me, like a digital diasporic consciousness always has a sort of critical orientation to like this hegemonic South Asian identity, or I shouldn't use so much academic jargon, but it has more of a critical position to sort of like this mainstream South Asian identity. And the ways that like indenture and like coolitude and like the ideas that we have in the aspects of Indo-Caribbean identity really challenge this like very like mainstream idea of South Asianness that we get from Bollywood, for example. So those are two of the main examples on social media that I looked at. But yeah, it was so interesting to see these like competing ideas of Indo-Caribbeanness being worked through in the space of social media. Whether or not you think of Indo-Caribbean as more of a discrete like ethnic and racial category with origins in Indian culture, or whether you think of Indo-Caribbean more broadly as a diasporic consciousness, like as a politicized identity that's shaped by migration and dislocation and the history of indenture. And like I said, those, your perception of that may be shaped by your location in the diaspora and where you're coming from. And music just turned out to be like the really fruitful ground where I was seeing people have these conversations.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. Always a pleasure to engage with you. And I know we'll have time for questions at the end. But thank you so much. I'm going to move ahead to Dr. Attai, and I shall share my screen. It is ready. Here we go. So I just realized I didn't plan this purposefully at all, that the ways in which, the contributors, presented, we have moved from the end of the book to the front of the book, to the first section of the book. And the first chapters of the collection present histories and narratives of migration and return from the personal to the political. They explore immigration schemes and diasporic movements, subjectivities and identity formations, and the ways in which migration and return may complicate identity, causing for renegotiations, maneuverings, and contemplation of erased or silenced histories by which bodies have come to have meaning in and outside of Caribbean spaces. Again, right, everything is so much, connected, right? Even though the volume is there are three, distinct, or maybe not so distinct sections, right? That thread there reminded me of something that Dr. Sankar just spoke about, the ways in which, migration, or the ways in which identity or understandings of identity, come to have different meanings, right? In outside of the Caribbean as opposed to in the Caribbean. So Dr. Attai, the collection opens with your chapter, and it's a beautiful chapter on memory, family, and home. It is entitled Memory Archives of a Not So Distant Past. Kufun Landolio Attai, 1917 to 1985. And I want to ask you, after you give, your greetings, right? What inspired you to do this memory work as you documented your grandfather's journeys and life in Trinidad and China? And what were some of the things you found out about your grandfather? And if you could just speak some more about doing memory work. What is memory work? How does one deal with the gaps, the silences of doing this sort of work?
Good. Hi, everyone. I'm just again so excited to be in community and to have this opportunity to share, to reflect, and again, just spend time with the IGDS family. As Dr. Hosein mentioned, I happened upon IGDS. That was in 2008 when, I was doing my research on trans communities in Trinidad, and this relationship has really filled me in many ways over the years. As I continue to receive mentorship and guidance in various ways from the IGDS family at St. Augustine, but across the campuses. So again, I'm just really happy to be in conversation with everyone and to celebrate this work, this exciting, important work. So thinking about how I got to this work, I must foreground it by saying I stumbled upon this project. I feel like I was called to do this project. And three seemingly unrelated things happened around this time. So the summer before I started writing, I was at a random book launch in Toronto. An author, Sheila Murray, published a novel called Finding Edward that traced this Jamaican guy who ended up in Toronto and ended up on this archival mystery to unpack some stuff. So and I chat about it in the chapter. And then my uncle also, Mitra or Uncle Clement Attai, he has been the one collecting all these family histories, keeping them neat and keeping them safe. And he started sending me a bunch of just documents, photos, like you can see here on the screen my granddad's immigration documents and stuff. So, keeping the family memory alive and stuff. And so when he sent me these, maybe a few days after I saw the call for this collection, so I was like, oh, maybe this is an opportunity to really just gather all my thoughts and sit with a lot of these things. And at that time too, I was also interested in really documenting my family's memory of my granddad. So my granddad died when I was 8 months, but he lived on through family stories, through memories at family gatherings, through cooking and stuff like that. So he would always be present in some form around me, and so I always had the joy of creating this image of who Grandpa was, right? My dad. So Grandpa had a shop in Toko, and then my dad took over the shop. So I grew up in this shop in Toko that my granddad had in Kumana. So again, like always being around these memories in the family. So these three things really, in retrospect, really encouraged me to write this chapter. And in one particular interview with my and conversation, my uncle, he I was really interested in really just hearing how the family remembers him. But then he pulls out this container and shows me a bunch of letters that Grandpa would have written to his mother while he was living in China. And I was stopped in my tracks. I was like, oh my God, this is something really important here, right? And it really provided an opportunity for me to, again, see who this person was. The letters were written over the course of his life from a child having gone back to China. So he was born in Trinidad and taken back to China, but with his dad and his uncle. And so I was able to see him writing letters over the course of a few years, from a child into early adulthood until he came back to Trinidad. And that was where I realized, wow, this is some really serious work here, right? It was a very emotional experience recreating this image, sitting with these letters over a summer, always going back to the letters and stuff. And I realized that this was really important work, really serious work, really hard work, but also fulfilling work, right? And I also started thinking about, kind of people who inspired me in my work. And so Saidiya Hartman really helped me to think about the ways that I'm able to tell this story, right? That is fractured by silence, by death, by trauma, uh, as a way to imagine what might have happened to my granddad as someone whose history, whose life may have had many silences. And as you read the chapter, as I comb through these documents, as immigration documents, family narratives, we see a lot of silences, right? That are fractured by trauma, right? Um, so I was able to really just sit and think about how my recreation of this memory fills a void in the family, in the larger narratives of the Chinese Trinidadian experience, um, and in the violent records, right? When we think about the violence of indentureship, the violence of enslavement, uh, and the ways that this trauma lives with us, right, as a continuing project. And I was just happy to sit with these stories, to reflect on the silences and so forth. And I found some really interesting things about my granddad. Um, One that, again, that's learning about this journey of being born in Trinidad, taken back to China, and realizing too that this was, a pretty common occurrence at that time, where Chinese, especially Chinese sons, will be taken back to China to learn the Chinese way. But in doing that, he experienced quite a lot of racism, being a mixed Chinese Trinidadian, right? His mother being uh, either Venezuelan or indigenous and something else, right? And having gone back to China with this mixed positionality, right? Being he would always speak about the violence and the racism he faced, and he would tell the family that, you can give me $1 million, I will never go back, right? And this was also a point that we noticed a lot of silence. He failed to or refused to pass on traditions, the language, customs, and all these things to my dad and his generation, and so there was a rupture happening there, right? He fought in the Chinese army at some point, right? He was uh, he was skilled in martial arts, and we see that in the review. So I look at the Bermuda's review that did a feature on him having the first supermarket in Arima, right? The first kind of walk-in supermarket with trolleys and stuff like that, where he reflected on the violence that the Chinese community was facing at that time, robberies and stuff. And he reflected on being close to the police station, but also in family narratives, we hear about him being able to fight, right? So I learned all these really interesting things that aren't apparent in the immediate archives that I had access to. And I'm just thinking about, again, that memory work. If I could probably just read quickly a piece, like how I reflect on memory work in the chapter, just as a way to provide some more context. So I think this is on page 13. So if anyone has access to the book, you could probably follow along. So I say, and I reflect, this sense of joy and gratification of being called to do memory work as an intentional practice of recalling, preserving, and interpreting personal or collective memories to understand their significance and impact on us. We must honor the dead, our ancestors whose stories must be cherished, and as the colonial feminist archive scholar Michelle Creswell reminds us, this work is slow and urgent, messy and strategic. It is imperfect, uncomfortable work. I'm haunted by the memory archives of documents and materials that preserve and serve as a repository of my family's collective memories and the artifacts, the things that are held securely in neat stacks, sealed boxes, forgotten piles, and fading recollections. And so we must attend to the items that are beckoning and waiting to be recovered as we connect my Trinidadian family to China and many other lands along an illuminating journey. Maybe this calling is gesturing to something else that I'm yet to discover, in the seemingly disparate memories in that box that this box brings together. While Saidiya Hartman gestures in Venus in 2 acts, I see myself as entering a mortuary as I read this archive and gain a glimpse of my grandfather's life after he has disappeared through death. But even in death, I can begin to imagine his and our life at the crossroads of empire, migration, and transnational movement. His story embodies the complex interplay of colonial powers, the forced and voluntary movements of people across geographies, and the cultural exchanges that shaped identities in the wake of imperial expansion, both in the Caribbean and China. As a grandchild of a Trinidad Chinese grandfather, I too wonder what happened when he packed up and left Trinidad and then China. I imagine parts of himself that were scattered across this journey in new and old places alike. The answer to these questions are becoming clearer as I reflect upon his thoughts and experiences, and even as I ask more questions, mostly to myself, to help me reflect on this archive. Through these fragments of memory and material artifacts, I can trace parts of the diaspora that led my family from China to Trinidad and from Trinidad to China, revealing an intricate web of global connections that have shaped our present. In honoring his memory, I not only reconnect with my personal history, but also engage with the broader narratives of displacement, resilience, and cultural hybridity that characterize the experience of so many who have navigated the tumultuous currents of empire and migration. And again, so this really reminds me of the importance of the kind of memory work I'm doing in this project. I'm really excited, and hopefully with the busy academic life that, I could really spend some more time. I've been interviewing my uncles, my aunts, really again thinking about how their memory and also doing this memory work with them. And I think that this helps me to kind of your last question, how do we deal with the gaps and archival silences? Again, especially when these gaps and silences are characterized by trauma, right? Various forms of trauma We tend to like to sweep things under the rug and just push it aside and not deal with stuff. So even this process, realizing again how my family is dealing with, again, these silences, it allows me more time to just reflect with them and rebuild this puzzle. But it also tells me a lot about, again, just even the Chinese Trinidadian experience and how continuing to deal with this trauma, deal with these histories, deal with these connections, really impact the work of sustaining community and sustaining histories, preserving histories, and so forth. And just to close, before we get into some more conversation, while I think about my granddad in this project, it also creates an opportunity for me to think about my other family. My grandmother is 98 currently, and she's Indo-Trinidadian, right? The daughter of parents who would have migrated through indentureship from Martinique, ended up on a plantation in St. James, and then settled in Togo. So even thinking about these movements and being Indo-Trinidadian as well as a really important part of my history, it reminds us too that these indentureship histories are so connected, right? My grandmother was from St. Vincent, so a Black woman from St. Vincent, having family from Venezuela as well, coming as contract workers on the cocoa plantation. So again, like I represent this this really complicated, nuanced mix of the indentureship experience. So I feel like this project has really opened up an opportunity for me to just do so much more work. So I'm hopeful that I could continue this project and do some more of this work, attend to the archival silences, and just build this memory bank for my family, but also just for those of us. I think all of us in the Caribbean could benefit from this kind of work.
Thank you so much. And it's indeed beautiful work. I cannot wait to see what you do with it. If it's, publishing it in a self-authored book or.
So I have videos of interviews. I want to go the route of probably some experimental documentary, to have some fun with telling these stories in another way as well.
Looking forward to that for sure. And I know we're a little bit over time. We're to start the Q&A very, very shortly. But I'll just speak for, as a true academic, I'll say we're out of time, but I'll speak some more. I'll just speak for 2 more minutes. And I truly come to this work as, as a juggler, Black woman, from Trinidad living in the global North, and having to experience a different way of thinking about race, racial quantification, racialization, etc. And that's how, how I come to this. And just very briefly in 1 minute, my own self-authored chapter. So I do have 2 chapters, one that is co-authored with Dr. Suan Barrett on juggler maneuverings, and this chapter, single author, Chinese Caribbean Narratives, Migration, Identity, Belonging at Home and Diaspora. And while I do not do the memory work that Dr. Attai engages in, it is, oral histories, right? Storytelling in this way. So it utilizes an oral history approach to share the stories of 7 Caribbean persons of Chinese and mixed Chinese descent who have left the Caribbean space and now reside in various spaces in the United States. So through the narrators' voices, we learn of family histories, displacement, migration from China to Jamaica to Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and the ways in which the narrators have maneuvered Chineseness, Caribbeanness, and for those who are mixed with Blackness at home in the Caribbean and in the United States. So through their own stories, we get a glimpse of this duality, their national and ethnic identities, and the leftover as theorized by Stuart Hall, and the contention of any which persists, and how these multiple identities are transformed in the diaspora. So in this way, migration can cause for a further re-ethnicization and changing self. And I'll just stop right there. I'm going to pass it back on to, let me stop sharing my screen. I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Hosein, who will take it from here, lead the Q&A. Dr. Hosein?
Hi, Aleah. So, this has been so rich, and I have so many thoughts. I want to thank you all. To be honest, I learned so much from each of you. There's so much happening in terms of the connections amongst the pieces, as you pointed out as well. So we do have about 20 minutes. To be honest, Aleah, I was now getting into hearing about the work. So I know you said, academics, I have 2 more minutes, but I'm going to present for 10. So I was settling in to hear all about, because I read the chapter as well. So I was settling in to hear some of that rich detail and analysis.
I try to stick to my word. I said to.
No, you did. But maybe in terms of answering some of the questions, maybe you can expand so we can hear a little bit more about your about the work you did in that chapter as well. I know I have some thoughts and questions, but I would like to open it up to those who are in the room. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you even just want to offer congratulations, if you want to share your stories, there's a funny thing that happens in this work where people start talking about their family, sort of inevitably. So if any of those things are what you want to share, now is the moment. So I'm just welcoming those who are in the session to engage with our presenters. Hi, Rachel. Rachel Taylor is a PhD candidate at the Institute. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I do have to say congratulations to Dr. Ranjitsingh and all the other authors in this edited collection. I was listening and I said, wow, this is a really, 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 really rich discussion. The book is a really rich one. And I particularly liked for Dr. Attai, how you went into your family history and memory making and that oral part of it, because it's something that, like you say, there are silences that exist. We don't really think about it, but hearing you do it, as Dr. Hosein said, it gets you into thinking about your own family history and how perhaps you can develop into academic work and make a contribution there for your family and for your wider community. So congratulations, everyone, and I really enjoyed the discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing more about Dr. Ranjitsingh's chapters.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for that. Congratulations. Does anybody have any questions for our authors or anything they wanted to ask about?
Good afternoon.
Hi, Stephen.
Yes, good afternoon. So I'm not, and my area of studies has nothing to do with this, but I connect with it because I think of myself as one of those people who is 2 steps removed from Indian ancestors, but parents born in Trinidad, but maybe born in England, and my daughter being born in Canada. And that part of that, I gave that preamble to explain my question. One of the speakers did touch on it, and it relates to definitions, because definitions are used for Asian and other things, but the people about whom we speak when we use these definitions may not always see themselves within the frame of those definitions. So I'll use the example of Asian. So my daughter is studying in Canada right now. As I said, I grew up where I grew up, and so on, right? Not all people of Indian descent see themselves as Asian. I'm just using that as one illustration. And the question is, how do we come upon universal definitions that can be accepted by all? And part of that is because if we're going to study things and we're going to recommend solutions to problems for these things, then the people who are the subject of the solutions have to buy into it. And if they don't accept the definitions, then it makes the resolution only in the cases where you need to solve things. I mean, sometimes you just need to describe, and that's okay. But when you need to resolve those issues, solve problems, how do you bring about the universal definitions or acceptance of some of the definitions?
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much. I mean, you're absolutely correct, right? And there's a lot of work done about the ways in which Indo-Caribbean people in the diaspora, particularly spaces in New York City, Richmond Hill, how they define self, right? Particularly like consensus forms, right? As Black or, and many would say, you're absolutely right? They are not Asian, which is the category they fall into, right? That migration now, like even in the oral histories that I conducted, that migration allows, or for the first time, the Caribbean immigrant is faced to engage with these multiple definitions and understandings, right? That they didn't have to, engage with in the Caribbean space. And Asian becomes that category, right? A choice for them in the global north or spaces like the United States of America. For this collection, I use the Asian Caribbean geographically, right? I'm speaking about those persons who would have come, from what we understand today, geographically as Asia. And of course, taking a diasporic perspective of what would be considered Asian, right, in the global north, right? And also, situating this work in Asian American studies, right? And Asian American studies have now, I think, and I know persons maybe like all the contributors, right, could jump in here. I would say in the last couple of years have made space for Indo-Caribbean people, right, have made space for, those, in the Caribbean space. In terms of, universalizing these descriptions, I don't know if that is a remedy or a solution to universalize, a term. And I don't think I'm doing that here. I think in everyone's chapter, they're very clear in using the language that the people that they are, maybe interviewing. For instance, I did oral histories. I used, and this is, part of a feminist methodology as well, right? Using, their voice, right, to define and describe, their experiences, how they define self. So I don't think universalizing is a solution. And you're absolutely right. Asian is not how many, particularly Indo-Caribbean people would describe themselves. But I use that language, one, geographically, and two, to, critically, right, for us to think about how the Indo-Caribbean body or the Chinese Caribbean body or the Javanese or Japanese Caribbean body is understood in the global north, in the diaspora. My son Nikoli, you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I echo that sentiment about universalizing might not necessarily be the remedy. And I immediately thought about like Gabby, the collection with Lisa Uttar on Indo-Caribbean feminist thought. Even though Ryan Pasadi is doing some interesting work in Toronto as well, looking at the contentions between like South Asian and Indo-Caribbean. And I think that that's the beauty of doing the work, right? That the Caribbean, Indo-Caribbean feminist thought has been really articulating what the complexities of being Indo-Caribbean, and especially in spaces like in diaspora spaces. I'm also thinking about a lot of activist work happening by groups like Lotus, Jahaji Sisters, groups coming out of Toronto and New York, and really articulating that being Indo-Caribbean is different from being South Asian, being from other part of a bigger Asian diaspora. There are nuances and complexities that are, I won't say unique, but central to the the experience of Indo-Caribbeanness, right? So I think it's important for us to really privilege that, and just to point to some other important work, right? So that really important text, Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thought, and again, the work of these activist groups in spaces like Toronto and New York City.
Anybody else, any of the authors want to add anything? All right, so we have a few minutes left, and
I think Dr. Soukaï was going to speak.
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in because I was reminded of a conversation I had with one of the writers I was working on, I'm still working on, who is from Guadeloupe. And he's probably the most prolific at the moment. He's also a retired politician, so quite well known for his political career, and is defense and activist defense of indianité, so Indianness in the French Caribbean. And actually, in one of our latest discussions, he was even telling me that Indo-Caribbean might not fit his conception of his own identity, how he sees himself. And he was introducing this nuance, which just came back to me, of naming himself or considering himself as a Guadeloupean of Indian descent instead of, saying Indo-Caribbean. So this might sound like, an endless discussion of terminology. That's why I think I do agree with what Aleah was saying and what was said also by Nikoli, and all of us agree with that universalization is definitely not the good approach. But I do understand where the question was coming from. Again, it reminds us, as you said, Aleah, of these categories on censuses and surveys that ask you to tick boxes and you never really fit. And then the only option you have would be other, but that sounds a bit degrading also to some extent, or a form of marginalization. So it's very complex, but as you rightly said, I think taking people's experiences and this is what we can do as scholars, basically. That's being more flexible than, the rigid codes and the kind of cold political or statistical data. And I do, so just to explain out maybe why this writer was saying, so he's a poet, writer, former politician, and cultural activist. And he was telling me, even if he promoted actually the concept of Indianity in the French Caribbean for the first time, so he was really, leading the charge for, recuperating Indian culture in the French Caribbean. And he told me that in the Caribbean for him was creating, even if it's an hyphenated term, a form of maybe a priority or a form of showcasing India perhaps before Caribbeanness. So, this is a debate, really. It's an hyphenated term. So do we consider that, it puts India first and the Caribbean second, or, but I do believe that some people might read along these lines and prefer, being called Caribbean of Indian descent, or, So when I was writing about his work, I, changed the concept, and I thought, let me respect what this person really wants. That's what matters most, after all. That's one of the privileges of being able to also interact with people. And I think having interviews is particularly interesting in that sense when the person is still around, of course, when the person is still there. That makes it really interesting, really, to have their own feedback. Thank you.
Can I just say one thing? So there are actually two, chapters in the collection I would like to highlight. And it's Christine Cahn's chapter 6, Unpacking Indo-Caribbean, right, through intersectional feminism in New York City. And also, I just lost it, After Indo-Caribbean, interrogating interstitial identities and diasporic solidarities in conversation with Hosein. And in these two chapters, the authors, truly interrogate, even, that descriptor Indo-Caribbean, right? And even gives us, the history of the term, and how it evolved. And even the ways that there are some Indo-Caribbean people who do not like the term, they do not want to be, defined as Indo-Caribbean. But I think this is part of the work, right? Part of being critical, part of, interrogating these contentions, etc. And thank you so much, Nikoli, for highlighting Dr. Hosein and Dr. Uttara's, edited collection, which is a very important intervention in the scholarship.
Stephen, I see you have your hand up. Maybe quickly, you might want to add something before we close.
All right. Yes. I'm not sure we'll be able to answer it, but I'll just place the point on the table, and it can be dealt with at a future time. So I would have wanted to have redirect the conversation from universalization of definitions to recognizing that definitions that are prescribed are not universally accepted, and I was trying to carry the discussion towards an addressing of that. And I'll just use some very quick illustrations. I spent a year in India, in Jamaica, and people who were part African and Indian were seen and saw themselves as Indian. And Alison Hennessy, in an interview, said when she grew up in Trinidad, she thought she was white, and when she went to England, she discovered she was black. So I didn't want to focus on the Indian part of it, but I used it because I look predominantly Indian, right? My point was about the use of terms to label people and races and categories of mixtures, but the people who are being studied may not accept those definitions or may not agree with those definitions. And in the cases where there's an attempt to solve a problem related to them, then they may not embrace the solutions. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Do you all have anything to add, or should we look to wrap up?
Thank you so much. I want to just hear Tarika's voice one more time.
Yeah.
Dr. Sankar's voice, just to pull you into the Zoom full picture.
Dr. Sankar, anything you'd like to add to this, or?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I was going to say, I think what I said was what I was going to say is mostly covered by everyone else, but I think when I think of Indo-Caribbean as diasporic consciousness, it is an attempt to sort of push back against narrow definitions, right? And think about identity more expansively. And that is what I'm trying to do with the term. It is tricky to like use a term like Indo-Caribbean as a way to try to fracture how it's been previously defined, but you still have to use the term. So it can be a little bit circular in that way. But yeah, when I think about Indo-Caribbean identity, I'm trying to imagine what can hold together that identity beyond like race or ethnicity, or beyond like these Indian like kind of cultural origins. That's where I come to the term of diasporic consciousness. So.
Well, I would like to say this has been very rich, very thoughtful. Aleah, as I might have mentioned in the beginning, your chapter interviewing people of Chinese descent who are now in the second migration, and the ways that they were navigating multiple identities, race-based time, race-based place, I think was so rich. And if you all, when you purchased the book, are interested in looking at how Dr. Ranjitsingh is using narrative analysis to craft a storytelling approach to sharing those kinds of perspectives and stories, I think it was very rich reading for me. And I'm glad we heard a little bit about it. Nikoli, I thought what you're presenting and that the highly personal, the nature of the ephemera that you're dealing with, the materiality of what exists, combined with the oral history, combined, of course, with the quarrel of history, that beyond which we can't ever really know. I think it's really interesting. I think what's interesting about your work as well is that you're able to bring together multiple strands of indenture. And I don't know of much scholarship there's not a lot of scholarship that is thinking about the Chinese experience of indenture, the Indian experience of indenture together. And so, amongst other experiences. And I think that is a really rich, just as you ended talking about your grandmother, that is a really rich intersection that hasn't been sufficiently explored. And I would really love to see more work from you on that. Looking forward to it. Sandrine, I remember telling Aleah when I read the chapters how what a provocation I thought it was to use post-amnesia. Amnesia as, given that the literary works that you're reading, which again highlights to us the value of not just sociological perspectives, but these vast range of writings being produced, fiction, non-fiction, activists, so on, and how rich that domain is for us to think with, in comparison to oral histories, in comparison to scholarly research. And I thought that your introduction of that was so interesting because in the Caribbean, because it really places the work in that twice removed context in a really specific way. And so I really grew from that. And Tarika, I valued how you're trying to work diasporic consciousness. I think there's a lot going on with your work as well. I thought that it was interesting that on the one hand, you were looking at the relationship between chutney and Bollywood, and then chutney music and the debate around, could it be characterized as Black music? And I thought it would have been interesting to explore if it is, say, characterized as Black music, given the visibility that category might hold in the Caribbean diaspora context, what does that mean for the way that it makes or doesn't make transoceanic connections with India and other sites that are not normally, with the Indian Ocean sites and not just the Atlantic, and what are some of the things that happen with that framing, particularly because what some of us are trying to do in this work is connect the Caribbean not to India, but to other sites of indenture and to the diasporas that emerge from those other sites of indenture and are then meeting in these other locations. I think this was really, really exciting for me because I'm here located in the Caribbean. And so it really shows how the work is developing out of the experience of migration as well. And I know, Aleah, that's a central theme in the work that you're doing, the question of migration. And of course, the concept of Indo-Caribbean, just to end there, I'm intrigued at how the concept of Indo-Caribbeanness develops different meanings. Sandrine, as you were saying, in Guadeloupe, Mutosami, expressing, and he's such a major figure as well, for example, or others about Indianity and so on. But the way that its development and movement in diasporic context, Caribbean diasporic context, has different movements in Caribbean context as well. And so how those concepts are moving back and forth. So I think this was a really rich session, conceptually, theoretically, spatially, temporally, and of course, in terms of storytelling. So I want to thank you all, say that this was really wonderful, and say that I again, please buy the collection. We only have had a glimpse of some of the chapters that this contributes to the field. And I think it's very important. And Dr. Ranjitsingh, I want to congratulate you and celebrate this achievement. Dr. Attai, Dr. Soukaï, Dr. Sankar, thank you all very, very much. And thank you to our audience. And finally, I would like to thank Lesedi Legault and Catherine Chan of the IGDS St. Augustine unit, and of